And you know what? It would be a chance to share a lot of these stories and feelings and the uniqueness of our.
For nearly half a century, Ron Howard carried a truth so heavy it threatened to overshadow every Oscar, every box office hit, every glowing headline attached to his name. Behind the warm smile of America's favorite red-haired director was a man haunted by choices he made in the shadows, choices that nearly destroyed the only thing he ever truly valued. A secret affair in 1979 that shattered the foundation of his young marriage. A custody scare in 1992 that broke him more deeply than any Hollywood failure ever could. $100 million film he walked away from at the peak of his fame, all to protect a family he had nearly lost because of his own mistakes. These were not the stories Hollywood wanted anyone to hear. These were not the kinds of memories studios print in legacy books. But Ron was done hiding, and when he finally spoke, he revealed a childhood shaped by ambition, a career built on pressure, and a personal life nearly crushed by the weight of success. Ronald William Howard was born on March 1st, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma, but his true birth into the public eye came much later, engineered, crafted, and molded by a father who understood the mechanics of Hollywood far better than most. Rance Howard wasn't the typical stage dad hungry for fame. He was something sharper, more strategic. He saw the industry like a battlefield, one where a child could survive only with discipline, structure, and relentless preparation. While most toddlers were stacking wooden blocks, Ron was standing under hot lights. Before he turned 2, he was already on film in Frontier Woman, a minor Western shot between 1955 and 1956, a project long forgotten by Hollywood history, but never forgotten by Rance. Every paycheck, every producer's name, every small opportunity was logged with military precision. Rance tracked Ron's residuals before Ron even knew how to speak in full sentences, anticipating every possible door that might one day open. Ron's mother, Jean Spiegel, an actress herself, had wanted peace, normalcy, a quiet life for her son. But the momentum was already in motion. The family relocated to California not for dreams, but for logistics. Proximity meant opportunity, and opportunity meant power. By 6 years old, Ron Howard was already something Hollywood rarely sees, a child who could act with the emotional depth of an adult. He knew the rhythm of a script before understanding multiplication. He hit marks instinctively, delivered lines with precision, and performed sadness not as an imitation, but as if he genuinely felt it. And on October 3rd, 1960, when little Opie Taylor first appeared on the Andy Griffith Show, the world saw a charming young actor, but insiders saw something else entirely. They saw a phenomenon, a child who wasn't acting, a child who was simply being. While other kids played baseball, Ron attended a small on-set school for 3 hours a day, and then spent the rest of his time living inside scenes, coached meticulously by his father between takes, emotion substitution, controlled expression, turning grief on and off like a faucet. It wasn't a talent, it was conditioning, and the cost was a childhood he would never get back. Even during The Music Man in 1962, terrified because he couldn't sing or tap dance, Ron pushed through. When he whispered to Shirley Jones, "I can't do it, Shirley," she saw a scared little boy, but she also saw a budding director, memorizing not only his own lines, but hers too, rehearsing not just his scenes, but imaginary scenes with dolls between takes. Film wasn't just his life, it was his escape, his language, his identity. But the price for that head start was steep. Ron didn't yet know that the discipline, the drive, the relentless work ethic his father carved into him would one day push him to greatness and nearly destroy everything he loved along the way. By the time Ron Howard reached 19, Hollywood already saw him as a seasoned professional, someone who had lived more hours on film sets than most actors twice his age. But inside, Ron felt something shifting, a desire he couldn't yet name, a hunger for a different kind of storytelling. When he walked into Gary Marshall's office in 1974 to audition for Happy Days, he didn't perform the lines like everyone else. He didn't try to impress with dramatic flair. He just sat down, ordered a cherry phosphate, and acted like he'd been living in that 1950s soda shop every day of his life. Marshall saw instantly that Ron wasn't pretending to be Richie Cunningham. He was Richie Cunningham. The contract he signed, 5 years, $7,500 per episode, was a miracle for a young actor. But Ron quickly learned that a miracle could also become a cage. By 1977, America loved Richie Cunningham. But Ron was suffocating inside him. The world outside was burning. Vietnam was reshaping the nation. Political tension was everywhere. Yet Happy Days insisted on staying frozen in a bubble where teenagers lived perfect lives untouched by reality. Ron hated it. He felt dishonest. He felt trapped in a smile that didn't belong to him anymore. He wrote a 3-page memo begging the network to allow a storyline addressing the war, even subtly. He wasn't asking for a political statement. He was asking for humanity. But the executives rejected it immediately. Advertisers wanted safety, consistency, no risks, no reality. So Ron turned somewhere else. He began directing. His first episode, A Date with Fonzie, aired in October 1977. He attempted a 90-second tracking shot normally reserved for high-budget productions, something no one expected a young sitcom star to even attempt, let alone execute flawlessly. But Ron nailed it in 2 takes, saving the studio thousands and boosting episode ratings by 12%. Nearly 31 million people watched that single episode. ABC wasn't just impressed, they were awake now. Ron Howard wasn't just an actor, he was a force. His ambitions grew, his confidence grew, and so did his success. In 1997, his film Grand Theft Auto made $15 million from a tiny $62,000 budget, a staggering 2,400% return. Suddenly, no one was laughing at the kid from Mayberry anymore. Ron was a serious filmmaker with serious potential. Then came June 7th, 1975, the day he married Cheryl, his high school sweetheart. They were just 21, young, hopeful, and in love. Henry Winkler was his best man, smiling proudly in every photo. On paper, it should have been the beginning of the perfect life, but reality was far more complicated. Ron's career was exploding. Cheryl was at home, alone with Bryce. Ron was on sets in different states, and soon in different countries. He told himself the long hours were necessary. He told himself he was building a future for his family. But slowly, silently, distance began to grow between them. Cheryl was lonely. Ron was exhausted. And Hollywood, relentless, glittering, seductive, kept pulling him deeper in. During a TV movie filmed in California in 1979, Ron reached a breaking point he didn't recognize until it was too late. In a moment of weakness, one he later described as the darkest choice of his life, he slept with a fellow actress. For 6 months, he hid it, buried it, pretended it never happened until it came out, not through confession, but through friends. Cheryl took Bryce and left for Arizona, spending 3 weeks with her mother. And for the first time, Ron Howard, the disciplined actor, the visionary director, The man who always had control completely fell apart. He entered intensive therapy, broke down the emotional walls he'd built since childhood, confronted the parts of himself he'd never been taught to face. He had mastered acting, he had mastered directing, but he had never mastered being present, being loyal, being a partner. When Cheryl finally returned, their marriage was still standing, but barely. Something had cracked, something deep and delicate, something no amount of fame or money could ever repair fully. Ron made a promise that day, one he believed he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep. After the fracture in his marriage, Ron threw himself even deeper into directing, believing that excellence could redeem him, that discipline could fix what he had broken. And in 1984, Splash changed everything. It didn't just mark the rise of Tom Hanks or showcase Daryl Hannah's daring underwater work. It marked Ron's ascension into major studio filmmaking, a modest budget between $8 to $11 million and a global gross of $69.8 million, a Hollywood breakthrough, a moment of triumph. But behind the applause, behind the headlines, another story was unfolding, one almost no one knew. Ron's younger brother, Clint Howard, had lived his own childhood under the burning lights of Hollywood. But Clint didn't rise the same way Ron did. He wasn't O.P. Taylor, he wasn't Richie Cunningham, he wasn't the prodigy directors whispered about. Hollywood hit Clint differently, sharper, colder, more unforgiving. By the mid-1980s, Clint was spiraling: cocaine, alcohol, failure, rejection. And worst of all, the suffocating belief that he would never live up to his older brother. By 1990, he had hit rock bottom. He stole from family members, lied about where he had been, showed up to Ron's office drunk, demanding money, demanding attention, demanding something he couldn't articulate. Ron faced a decision that tore him apart, one shaped by the directness his father, Rance, had drilled into him since childhood. He said the words with brutal clarity: go to rehab or lose the relationship. No negotiation, no soft landing, no middle ground. Clint chose rehab. 90 days in a Malibu facility. He survived. But Ron carried the guilt for years afterward. He blamed himself, believing his success had shadowed his brother, believing his rise had made Clint feel smaller, believing that the industry that lifted him up had simultaneously crushed the sibling he loved. No award would ever erase that ache. But guilt was something Ron had learned to bury, and Hollywood was always ready to hand him another mountain to climb. In 1995, Apollo 13 became that mountain. Ron approached the film with an obsession bordering on self-destruction. He refused to fake anything. NASA panels were purchased for $1 each. Authentic switch placements, real radio transmissions, precise lighting. They flew 612 zero-gravity scenes aboard the Vomit Comet. Each one lasted 23 seconds, 10 straight days of brutal parabolic dives. During one test, a blast of heat singed Ed Harris's eyebrows. Ron made them shoot it again. He worked 18-hour days for 90 consecutive days. On day 90, his body collapsed. Dehydration, hypertension, sheer exhaustion. The crew went silent. When he returned, they wore shirts reading "Mission Controlled," a gesture of respect, a gesture of concern. But even that collapse did not fully prepare him for what came next. When Ron returned home after the film wrapped, Cheryl noticed immediately he was thinner, quieter, haunted. The dark circles under his eyes didn't fade, and yet he pushed forward. Then came Far and Away in 1992, an Irish shoot that lasted 6 months, the longest absence of his life. Cheryl was home alone with all the children. Bryce was 9. The twins were newborns. Ron was thousands of miles away, buried in work. When he finally returned home, Bryce hesitated when she heard his voice. The twins didn't recognize him at all. That moment broke him in a way even the Apollo 13 collapse couldn't. For the first time, Ron didn't see his achievements. He saw the cost. He saw what Cheryl had endured, what the children had lost, what he had sacrificed without realizing it. That night, Ron made a vow that was deeper than the promise he made after his affair. No more international shoots longer than 6 weeks. He kept that promise for 13 years. But Hollywood was a machine that consumed promises whole, and eventually it would test him again. By the early 2000s, Ron Howard had become one of the most respected directors in the world, an artist with both commercial power and critical prestige. And in 2001, that prestige solidified into history when A Beautiful Mind earned Ron the Oscar for Best Director. The film grossed $313 million worldwide, elevating Ron to a rare category of filmmakers whose work shaped culture as much as it entertained. But beneath the applause was another truth, one that critics eventually seized. They noticed what Ron left out of John Nash's real story: the affairs, the abandoned son, the darkest edges of a complicated genius. Ron admitted privately years later that he understood the criticism completely, because the truth was this: the film wasn't just about Nash, it was about Ron himself. He understood what it meant to live two lives, one polished for the world, one hidden from it. He knew what it meant to curate an image, to conceal pain, to protect a legacy at the expense of full honesty. A Beautiful Mind wasn't just a movie, it was a confession in disguise. But life rarely offers clarity for long. And in 2005, the storm returned. That year, Cinderella Man required extensive reshoots. And Ron, despite every vow he had made after the Ireland shoot, despite the promise he had kept faithfully for 13 years, broke that promise. He packed his bags, he left Cheryl alone again. He left the children again. And this time, the absence lasted 8 weeks. When he walked through the door upon returning, he immediately sensed it. Cheryl had changed. She wasn't angry. Anger would have made sense. Anger would have been something to fight, something to fix. Instead, she was polite, quiet, distant. She moved around the house like a separate soul, present but unreachable. No accusations, no tears, no confrontation, just silent assessment. Ron didn't realize it immediately, but that year marked the beginning of something he didn't see coming. Cheryl was deciding whether to stay. Still, Hollywood waited for no one, and in 2006, Ron stepped into one of the most controversial productions of his career, The Da Vinci Code. With the $125 million budget, it was a massive undertaking, one plagued with global backlash. The Catholic Church condemned it. Churches banned filming inside their walls. Entire locations shut their doors. Ron's team had to recreate settings digitally or hunt for alternate places across Europe. It was a logistical nightmare, a war of creativity versus outrage. The film grossed $758 million, a staggering triumph for any director. But for Ron, it was the year he almost lost everything. As the public celebrated his success, Ron found himself lying awake at night thinking about Cheryl, thinking about the promises he broke, thinking about whether success meant anything if the person he built his life with no longer felt connected to him. He had fame, he had wealth, he had awards, but at home, his marriage, once his anchor, was quietly slipping away. Then in 2008, Ron directed Frost Nixon. It was a quieter film, intimate, cerebral, two men in a psychological battle. But audiences and critics alike noticed something else. The film felt personal, almost painfully personal. Every hesitation, every unspoken truth, every moment of emotional restraint, it reflected a man wrestling with truths he hadn't yet spoken aloud. And while the film went on to earn 5 Oscar nominations, it barely made $28.5 million, losing money. But for the first time in his life, Ron wasn't devastated by the box office failure. He realized something profound. Money wasn't the measure anymore. Not for him. Not for the man he was becoming. What mattered now wasn't success. It was redemption. And redemption, he knew, required honesty about his past, his family, his failings, and the price his ambition had forced others to pay. By the time the 2010s arrived, Ron Howard was no longer just a Hollywood success story, he was an institution. But institutions can still carry deep wounds, and Ron's would surface in unexpected places. In 2020, when Ron directed Hillbilly Elegy, the reaction was brutal. The film cost $45 million and was torn apart by critics. They called it uneven, simplistic, misguided, but Ron didn't break under the criticism. Not this time. He had lived through harsher storms, many of them self-inflicted. And because the world didn't know what he had been filming privately that same year, Rebuilding Paradise, a documentary about the 2018 Camp Fire, the deadliest wildfire in California's history. But for Ron, it wasn't just a national tragedy. It was personal. His mother-in-law lived in Paradise. Ron spent more than a year filming the survivors, sifting through ashes, looking directly at devastation instead of cutting around it. The footage shattered him. He didn't hide behind shots or structure. He didn't look away. He let the pain in. He later admitted privately this was the hardest project of his career, not because of logistics, but because it forced him to confront what mattered: family, stability, presence, the very things he had jeopardized for decades. And then came 2025, a milestone most Hollywood marriages never reach. Ron and Cheryl celebrated 50 years together. Friends saw a beautiful couple who had beaten the odds, who had weathered storms that would have destroyed others. But behind that celebration lay a lifetime of a sacrifice, most of it on Cheryl's shoulders. Ron donated a bench to John Burroughs High School, the same school where he and Cheryl first met. A small gesture, but deeply symbolic, his way of acknowledging their shared beginning, the history she had protected even when he had neglected it. On that anniversary, Ron confessed something he had kept buried for far too long. He regretted how much of their life he had missed. He regretted the nights she slept alone while he chased perfection across continents. He regretted the milestones with the children he missed while he built a career that often consumed him. He regretted the promises he broke, especially the ones that cut the deepest. He also finally understood something that had taken him decades to see with clarity. Cheryl had been the one holding the family together. Not him, not the money, not the success, not the awards. Her. Even after all the distance, the heartbreak, the infidelity, the years spent raising their children alone, while Ron lived in hotel rooms and editing bays, she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she believed in the man he could become. And in the end, Ron finally became that man. He slowed down. He talked openly with young directors. He told them stories, real stories, about mistakes, temptation, ambition, and the price every artist eventually pays. He warned them not to lose themselves the way he once had, not to forget the people who love them while they chase, the people who applaud them. Because now, in his later years, Ron sees everything differently. He remembers the bench. He remembers the empty seat at the dinner table. He remembers the 3 weeks when Cheryl left with Bryce. He remembers the twins not knowing his voice. He remembers his brother almost losing himself. He remembers the collapse on the Apollo 13 set. He remembers every moment he pushed too hard, every moment he looked away, every moment he chose ambition over presence. And those memories shape him now more than fame ever did. In the end, Ron Howard's story isn't about the glamour of Hollywood, the money, the Oscars, or the billion-dollar box office totals. It isn't about the fame he earned or the legacy others built around his name. It's about something much quieter, much harder, much more human. It's about a man raised in front of cameras, shaped by ambition before he could spell the word, and pushed into adulthood long before he ever understood what adulthood required. It's about a father who meant well but taught discipline instead of vulnerability, a childhood that rewarded perfection but never taught presence, a career that soared but at the cost of the relationships that truly mattered. When Ron speaks now, when he mentors young filmmakers or sits for private interviews, there is a gentleness, a clarity, almost a sadness in the way he describes his past. Not because he regrets the art he created, but because he understands the trade he made to build it. He can trace the timeline of his mistakes as easily as he can trace the timeline of his films. He remembers 1979, the affair that almost ended his marriage before it truly began. He remembers 1992, the shoot that lasted so long his own children no longer recognized him. He remembers 2005, the broken promise that caused Cheryl to withdraw into silence. He remembers every moment he chose work because it was easier than choosing honesty, and yet he also remembers the ways he tried to fix it. He remembers therapy. He remembers rebuilding trust. He remembers staying home for 13 years to honor a promise. He remembers choosing family over a $100 million project. He remembers slowing down, growing up, becoming someone Cheryl could truly stay with. This is the Ron Howard Hollywood never marketed. Not the prodigy, not the Oscar-winning director, not the box office giant, but the man, a man who failed, a man who broke things, a man who learned, a man who changed. Now, in the later chapters of his life, Ron understands legacy in a way younger Ron never could. Legacy isn't measured in awards, not in money, not in prestige, not in headlines. Legacy is measured at the dinner table, in the sound of your children saying, "Dad," in the eyes of the person who stayed despite everything, in the marriage that survived storms no camera ever captured. Ron Howard has directed some of the most powerful stories in modern cinema, but the greatest story he ever lived was the story of how he found his way back to the people who loved him long before Hollywood ever did. And now, with age softening the edges of ambition, he carries his past differently, not as shame, not as regret, but as truth. A truth he's finally ready to share.